The topic of this slideshow is the U.S. Constitution. In this slideshow, we are going to cover the Road to Independence, the Articles of Confederation, drafting a new Constitution, the fight for ratification, and the underlying theory of the Constitution. In fighting the British, the Continental Army struggled because of a lack of a strong national government. Every decision had to be approved by state governments, which prevented agreements on taxing, how many uniforms the Army needed, and how much food the Army needed, among other things. Governments need to be able to enforce agreements. The inability to take collective action led to free riding among the states. States were hesitant to provide resources needed to fight the British. Early in the colonial era, Great Britain realized that they had limited capacity to govern. One solution for Great Britain was to give the colonies home rule. Home rule allowed the colonies to handle their own domestic affairs, including taxation. Even before independence, Americans were not familiar with self-governance. Not unfamiliar with self-governance. They controlled their local affairs, but relied on Great Britain for military protection. During the French and Indian War, Great Britain called a meeting of the representatives from 13 colonies. They were searching for assistance, but only 6 colonies showed up to the conference. At this conference, Ben Franklin made the first proposal for a national government for the colonies. At this time, the idea gained very little support. The British defeated the French in the French and Indian War. However, the cost of the war led Great Britain to look to the colonies to contribute more. Great Britain begins to challenge home rule through things like the Stamp Act, which placed a tax on all printed materials. In response to the Stamp Act, the colonies banded together in opposition to Great Britain. They wrote a resolution condemning the Stamp Act, but could not agree on a course of action. Eventually, citizen groups revolted against other new taxes, leading to the Boston Tea Party. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774 to reinforce home rule and to plan a boycott on British goods. By the time the Second Continental Congress met, war had broken out, and it became more necessary to act like a national government. At the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, states' governments were called upon to form state governments that had republican principles. This meant that state governments should have bicameral legislatures and governors. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, an argument for separation from Great Britain. Around this time, Jefferson volunteered to write the Declaration of Independence. Once completed, Jefferson's colleagues amended his list of grievances, including striking an indictment of Great Britain for introducing slavery to the colonies from the original document. The first Constitution of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. This Constitution created a confederation, which is a highly decentralized system in which the national government derives limited authority from the states rather than directly from the citizens. The states selected officials for the national government and had authority to override national government decisions. in order for laws to be approved, 9 out of 13 states had to vote in favor, and fundamental changes, such as taxation, required unanimous approval. There were several problems with the Articles of Confederation. First, the Confederation was too decentralized to fight the British. Second, states were hesitant to commit fully to the war effort for fear that other states were going to free ride. Third, after a peace treaty was signed with the British, the nation faced a large debt of about $35 million. The army needed to be paid, but again, states were hesitant to contribute for fear that other states would not meet their obligations. It became apparent that the Articles of Confederation were not going to work and that a new constitution had to be drafted. It is worth highlighting a few philosophers that influenced the thinking behind the new constitution. Locke provided the idea of popular sovereignty, where citizens delegate authority to their agents in governments with the ability to rescind that authority. Locke also stressed individual rights and limited government authority. Montesquieu provided the classification of governmental functions into the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Hume treated politics as a competition among competing interests. All of the philosophers had a strong influence on drafting the new Constitution. Delegates met in Philadelphia in May of 1787 to rework the Articles of Confederation. The delegates almost unanimously elected General George Washington to preside over deliberations. They agreed that proceedings would be secret to allow for a frank discussion of views. Part of the agreement even meant keeping the windows closed during discussion, which was inconvenient because the summer of 1787 was one of the hottest summers in Philadelphia's history. The deliberations ultimately led to the consideration of two proposals, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan was supported by James Madison. The proposal included 2 chambers in the legislature with representation based on population. The lower house would be elected by the citizenry, while the upper chamber, executive, and courts would be elected by the lower house. The legislature would be able to make any law and veto any state legislation. The Council of Revision, made up of the executive and the court, would have the power to veto legislation, though the legislature could override a veto by a majority vote. The New Jersey Plan was supported by delegates from less populated states. In the New Jersey Plan, there would be a single chamber with equal representation for each state regardless of population. The legislatures maintained the same power as under the Articles of Confederation, with the added authority to levy taxes and regulate commerce. The executive could be removed by the legislature through a petition of a majority of the states, and the courts would be appointed by the executive. The two incompatible proposals with support from different states forced a compromise. The compromise resulted in a 2-chamber legislature, one based on population, the House of Representatives, and the other with equal representation for each state, the Senate. The compromise gave more power to the national government. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gave the national legislature the power to declare war, maintain the Army and the Navy, and borrow money. The new Constitution also included a system of checks and balances, which maintained the separation of powers among the branches of government. Alexander Hamilton fought the hardest for an independent executive. Article 2 of the Constitution states that the role of the President is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. The President was given the power to veto legislation, but the veto could be overridden by a two-thirds majority of the legislature. One important check on executive power the legislature was given was the power of the Senate to confirm appointments and ratify treaties before they go into effect. Also, Congress could declare war. Article 6 gave national laws precedence over state laws when both properly discharged their government's respective responsibilities. Over the years, the Supreme Court has become a lever for expanding national policymaking. The court was given the right to strike down executive decisions it deems unconstitutional, a right called judicial review. This right was not explicitly written into the Constitution, but instead granted through a ruling in the court case Marbury v. Madison. Ratification of the new Constitution was not seamless. The Federalists were the voice of nationalism, which meant a strong national government. The Anti-Federalists were the voice of states' rights, those who supported the ideas behind the decentralized Articles of Confederation. Anti-Federalists attacked the Federalists for invading citizens' rights. Madison responded to the criticism by introducing amendments to the Constitution, which became the Bill of Rights. New York and Virginia were eventually the last states to ratify the new Constitution. In an effort to fight criticism from anti-Federalists, Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, dispersed the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers were over 80 essays written in support of the new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists had trouble keeping up with the arguments distributed by the Federalists. Two especially important essays in the Federalist Papers were Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Federalist 10 responded to the argument that a large republic could not survive. It argued in favor of a republic that prevents a majority of citizens from tyrannizing the minority. In Federalist 10, James Madison argued that factions could infringe on the rights of citizens and force action contrary to the interests of the community as a whole. Factions were defined as a number of citizens, whether accounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, averse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Madison argued that the national government would be less susceptible to the influence of factions than state governments because representatives would be forced to moderate their views. Federalist 51 was an attempt to reassure fence-sitters that the Constitution would not be a step toward tyranny. In Federalist 51, Madison lays out how and why the national government would work by including checks and balances and separation of powers. In this slideshow, we have covered the Constitution. Please do not forget to take quizzes on Chapter 1 and 2 prior to the due date. In the next slideshow, we will discuss federalism.